Ever have one of those moments where time just stops? Where you realize, in a heartbeat, that you've ruined everything? I watched her look at him. I saw the way her lip curled, just a tiny bit. She didn't know the cameras were rolling. She didn't know who he was. And she definitely didn't know that by tomorrow morning, her entire world would be gone. It was one of those stiflingly hot afternoons in Chicago, the kind where the air feels like a damp wool blanket pressing against your skin. Elena stood in the lobby of the Sterling Heights Plaza, smoothing out her silk skirt for the 10th time. She was perfect. Or, at least, that's what she told herself in the reflection of the gold-tinted elevator doors. To Elena, image wasn't just part of the job. It was the job. She had spent 15 years climbing the ladder of luxury real estate, trading in her soul piece by piece for corner offices and a zip code that made people's eyes widen when she mentioned it at dinner parties. Her phone buzzed in her hand. A text from her assistant, Sarah. "He's 5 minutes out. Very important person entrance." Elena exhaled, a sharp, practiced breath. This was the deal. The Vanguard Project, a multi-billion-dollar redevelopment that would turn a crumbling industrial district into a tech mecca. It was the kind of deal that didn't just make a career, it minted a legacy. The lead investor was a ghost, a man named Elias Thorne. People knew the name, but few had seen the face. He was the silent power behind half the skyscrapers piercing the skyline, a man who moved billions with a whisper. She stepped toward the glass revolving doors as a sleek, matte black SUV pulled to the curb. Her heart did a strange little flutter, not of excitement, but of predatory anticipation. She had her pitch memorized. She had her smile fixed. The door opened. A man stepped out. He was tall, wearing a charcoal suit that probably cost more than Elena's first car. He was also black. Elena's smile didn't drop, but it stiffened. It was a subtle shift, the kind of micro-expression only a trained observer would catch. In her mind, a series of outdated, dusty gears began to grind. She hadn't expected him. She looked past him for a moment, searching the car for an older white man. The real Elias Thorne, perhaps? But there was no one else. The man walked toward her with a stride that owned the pavement beneath his feet. He stopped 3 feet away, his expression neutral, but his eyes, God, his eyes were like deep, still water. He reached out a hand that had signed more high-stakes contracts than Elena had ever seen. "Mr. Thorne?" Elena asked, her voice a pitch higher than usual. "Just Elias," he said. His voice was a rich baritone, steady and calm. He kept his hand extended. It stayed there in the humid air between them. Elena looked at it. She felt a sudden, inexplicable surge of coldness. It wasn't logic. It wasn't even a conscious thought. It was a deep-seated, ugly reflex, the kind of prejudice that hides in the shadows of a person's upbringing until it's called into the light. She thought about the board members. She thought about her brand. And in a moment of pure, unadulterated arrogance, she decided he was the one who needed to prove himself to her. She didn't take his hand. Instead, she gave a tight, dismissive nod and tucked her hands firmly behind her back. "We're running behind schedule, Elias. The boardroom is this way. I've had the catering set up, though I'm sure you're used to different fare." The silence that followed was heavy. It wasn't just quiet, it was a vacuum. Elias Thorne didn't look offended. He didn't look angry. He simply looked at his own hand for a split second, then slowly, deliberately, pulled it back and tucked it into his pocket. He looked at her then, really looked at her, and for the first time in her life, Elena felt small. "Lead the way," he said quietly. As they walked toward the elevators, Elena felt a prickle of sweat on her neck. She told herself she was being professional. She told herself she was maintaining boundaries, but deep down, in that place we all try to ignore, a small voice told her she had just stepped off a cliff. The boardroom was on the 52nd floor, a glass box suspended over the city. Usually the view made Elena feel like a queen overlooking her kingdom, but as the elevator rose, the pressure change made her ears pop and her stomach turn. Elias stood next to her, not saying a word. He wasn't checking his phone. He wasn't fidgeting. He was just there. His presence filled the small space, making the polished chrome and mirrors feel claustrophobic. Elena caught her reflection. She looked composed, but her knuckles were white as she gripped her leather portfolio. "Beautiful city," Elias said suddenly. He wasn't looking at her. He was looking through the glass doors at the sprawling grid of Chicago. The best, Elena managed to say, her voice sounding thin. If you know how to handle it. I find that cities handle people more often than the other way around, he replied. There was a hidden edge to his words, a quiet philosophy that Elena didn't have the patience to unpack. She was thinking about the commission. She was thinking about the $2.4 billion in liquidity Thorne was rumored to be bringing to the table. When the doors opened, her team was waiting. 6 junior executives, all in varying shades of navy and gray, stood like soldiers. They saw Elias, and for a second, there was a collective blink surprise. The same surprise Elena had felt, but they were professionals. They moved to shake his hand, but Elias kept his hands in his pockets now. He just nodded, a polite, distant gesture that seemed to chill the room by 10 degrees. The meeting was a masterclass in tension. Elena spoke for 40 minutes. She showed slides of glass towers, green spaces, and luxury retail hubs. She talked about demographic shifts and high-yield potential. She used all the buzzwords that usually made investors salivate. But Elias Thorne just sat there. He didn't take notes. He didn't interrupt. He watched her with an intensity that felt like a physical weight. At one point, Elena paused to take a sip of water. The room was silent, save for the hum of the HVAC system. "Do you have any questions regarding the zoning, Elias?" she asked, trying to regain the upper hand. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the mahogany table. "I'm less interested in the zoning, Elena. I'm interested in the foundation. The foundation is solid rock," she said quickly. "We've had the surveys." "I'm not talking about the dirt," Elias interrupted. His voice wasn't loud, but it stopped her cold. "I'm talking about the people. This project is supposed to serve a community, but looking at your plans, I see a lot of walls. I see a lot of exclusivity. I see a vision of a world that doesn't actually exist anymore, or shouldn't." Elena felt a flush of heat creep up her neck. "Exclusivity is what drives the price point, Elias. We aren't building a park. We're building an asset." He smiled then, but it wasn't a warm smile. It was the smile of a man who had already seen the end of the movie. An asset is only valuable if the people behind it have integrity. Without that, it's just a pile of expensive glass waiting to shatter. He stood up abruptly. The meeting wasn't over. They hadn't even reached the financial projections, but he was buttoning his jacket. "I've seen enough for today," he said. "Wait," Elena said, her chair screeching against the floor as she stood. "We haven't discussed the escrow terms. The board is expecting a signature on the letter of intent." Elias walked toward the door. He stopped and turned back to her. The junior executives were frozen, looking between their boss and the billionaire. "You know, Elena," he said softly, "my father was a janitor in a building just like this. He used to say you can tell everything you need to know about a person by how they treat someone who can do absolutely nothing for them." He looked at her hands, still tucked away, refusing the ghost of a handshake that was no longer offered. "I'll make my decision by morning," he said. He walked out. No handshake, no goodbye to the team, just the sound of the heavy oak door clicking shut. Elena stood there for a long time, the silence in the room ringing in her ears. One of the juniors, a kid named Marcus, cleared his throat. "That went well?" "Shut up, Marcus," Elena snapped. "Ped." She sat back down, her heart hammering against her ribs. She was fine. She had to be fine. She was Elena Vance. She didn't lose. She checked her watch. 5 p.m. She just needed to go home, have a glass of scotch, and wait for the confirmation email. Men like Thorne didn't walk away from deals this big over a vibe. Money spoke louder than manners. That's what she told herself as she watched the sun begin to set, turning the Chicago skyline into a jagged silhouette of gold and shadow. But as she left the office that night, she noticed the security guard, a man she'd walked past for 5 years without ever learning his name, looking at her. Usually he'd nod. Today he just watched her pass, his face a mask of quiet observation. Elena felt a shiver. The air felt thin, like the oxygen was slowly being sucked out of the sit. Elena didn't sleep. She sat in her darkened apartment, a glass of Macallan 18 sweating on the marble coaster, watching the lights of the city flicker like a dying nervous system. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw that hand, Elias Thorne's hand, hanging there in the air. It felt like a physical weight now, a phantom limb haunting her conscience. But she pushed the feeling down. She called it nerves. She called it deal fatigue. She refused to call it what it actually was. Around 3 a.m., the wind picked up, rattling the floor-to-ceiling windows of her penthouse. It was a lonely sound. Elena realized with a sudden sharp pang that she didn't have anyone to call, not to talk about the deal, but to just talk. Her mother lived in a gated community in Florida, funded by Elena's commissions, and their conversations were mostly about property taxes and weather. Her friends were competitors. Her lovers were networking opportunities. She was surrounded by the finest things money could buy, yet the silence in the room felt like it was screaming. She picked up her phone. No emails from Thorne's camp. No thank you for your time. Just nothing. She started pacing. Her bare feet clicked on the cold hardwood. Maybe I should have shaken it, she thought. Then immediately the defense mechanism kicked in. No, I was maintaining a position of power. He's a disruptor. He was testing me, and I stood my ground. She repeated the lie until it sounded like a prayer. As the sun began to bleed over Lake Michigan, turning the water a bruised purple, Elena showered and dressed in a power suit the color of dried blood. She applied her makeup like war paint. She needed to be in the office before the markets opened. She needed to be there when the wire transfer notification arrived. She arrived at the Sterling Heights Plaza at 6:45 a.m. The lobby was unusually quiet. Even the espresso bar, usually bustling with early bird analysts, was empty. The air felt heavy, charged with the kind of static you feel right before a massive thunderstorm. When she reached the 52nd floor, Sarah, her assistant, was already at her desk. Sarah's face was the company. Lore of Ash. She didn't look up when Elena walked in. She was staring at her computer screen, her hands hovering over the keyboard like she was afraid to touch it. "Sarah?" Elena said, her voice sounding unnaturally loud in the hushed office. "Did we get the confirmation from Vanguard? Is the escrow funded?" Sarah didn't answer. She just pointed at the television mounted on the wall, usually tuned to a muted financial news loop. Elena looked up. The ticker at the bottom of the screen was a blur of red. The headline across the screen read, "Vanguard Holdings pulls out of all Chicago developments. Thorne announces total divestment." Elena felt a cold drop of sweat slide down her spine. That can't be right," she whispered. "That's just a headline. It's a negotiation tactic. He's trying to squeeze us on the points." "It's not just a tactic, Elena," Sarah said, her voice trembling. She finally looked up, and for the first time, Elena saw pity in her eyes. "Look at the secondary markets. Look at the REITs." Elena lunged for her own desk, her fingers fumbling as she logged into her terminal. Her vision blurred as the numbers loaded. The Sterling Heights Group, her firm, her life's work, wasn't just down, it was cratering. Vanguard Holdings didn't just pull out of the $2.4 billion deal, they had shorted the entire sector. Elias Thorne had spent the night liquidating every asset tied to Elena's firm and its partners. He hadn't just walked away from the table, he had flipped the table over and set the room on fire. By 8:15 a.m., the phone started. Not the polite inquiries of clients, but the panicked screams of investors. Elena's private line rang. It was the chairman of the board, Arthur Sterling. "Elena," he said, and the way he spoke her name felt like a eulogy. "What did you do?" "Arthur, we had a meeting. It was standard. We discussed the projections." "I'm looking at a personal message from Elias Thorne," Arthur interrupted. His voice was deathly quiet. He didn't send a legal brief. He didn't send a list of grievances. He sent a 5-second clip from the lobby security feed. No sound. Just you, Elena. Just you and your hands behind your back while he offered you his... Elena's heart stopped. The cameras. She had forgotten the lobby cameras. "Arthur, that's out of context," she stammered, her mind racing to find a way to spin it. "I was concerned about... I didn't feel well. He's moved his capital to the South Side Initiative," Arthur said, ignoring her. "He's funding the rival firm. The $2.4 billion isn't gone from the city, Elena. It's just gone from us. And because of the cross-collateralization clauses, we're finished. The firm is filing for Chapter 7 by noon." "Chapter 7? Elena gasped. "Arthur, no, we can fix this. I'll go to his office. I'll apologize. You'll stay away from him," Arthur snapped. "You're done, Elena. Don't bother packing your things. Security will send them to your home. If you have a home." E left after the clawbacks. The line went dead. Elena sat in the silence of her corner office. Outside, the city moved on, indifferent to the fact that her entire universe had just evaporated. $2.4 billion. Gone. Not because of a bad market, not because of a failed product, but because of a choice she made in a heartbeat of pride. She looked at her hand, the hand she had refused to give. It looked the same, perfectly manicured, expensive rings, soft skin, but it felt heavy now. It felt like lead. She realized then that Elias Thorne hadn't taken her money. He had simply revealed that she was bankrupt long before the markets opened. The silence that followed the dial tone was the loudest thing Elena had ever heard. It wasn't just the quiet of an empty office. It was the sound of a vacuum sucking the oxygen out of her lungs. She looked around her office, the Eames chair, the original Basquiat sketch on the wall, the view that made everyone else look like ants, and realized it was all just a movie set. And the director had just yelled, "Cut." She stood up, her legs feeling like they were made of water. Her reflection in the glass didn't look like a high-powered executive anymore. She looked like a ghost haunting her own life. She grabbed her designer handbag, a bag that cost more than Sarah's car, and realized she didn't even want it. It felt like a weight, a reminder of every shallow victory she'd ever celebrated. As she walked out of her office, the bullpen was a scene of rolled chaos. People were crying. Others were shouting into phones. Marcus, the young associate, was stuffing his personal belongings into a cardboard box, his face pale. When he saw Elena, he didn't look away like he usually did out of habit or respect. He looked straight at her with a raw, burning resentment. "I hope it was worth it," he spat. Elena didn't answer. She couldn't. She walked toward the elevators, the very place where her downfall began. The ride down felt like a descent into the basement of her soul. When the doors opened into the lobby, she saw him, not Elias, but the security guard, the one she'd ignored for years. He was standing by the desk, watching the news on a small tablet. He looked up as she approached. For a second, Elena felt a surge of her old habit, to look through him, but she stopped. She actually saw him. She saw the lines around his eyes, the gray in his hair, the wedding ring worn thin on his finger. "I'm sorry," she whispered. It was the first time she had said those words to anyone in a decade. The guard tilted his head, a flicker of surprise crossing his face. "For what, Miss Vance?" "Everything," she said, her voice cracking. She walked out into the Chicago air, and for the first time, the heat didn't feel stifling. It felt real. The city was moving, breathing, and completely unaware that Elena Vance was no longer a player. She started walking. She didn't call an Uber. She didn't call her driver. She just walked until her feet ached. In her 5-inch heels, until the sun was high and the shadows were short. She found herself in a part of the city she never visited. The South Side, the place Elias had mentioned. It wasn't the wasteland the brochures in her office made it out to be. It was full of life. There were kids playing under open fire hydrants, grandmothers sitting on stoops, and the smell of charcoal grills and laundry soap. She sat on a park bench, her expensive suit looking ridiculous in this setting. A group of teenagers walked by, laughing, and one of them glanced at her. "You okay, lady?" he asked, not with malice, but with a genuine, confused curiosity. I think I'm just realizing I've been lost for a long time," she said. The boy shrugged and kept walking. Elena stayed there for hours. She thought about her childhood, the way her father had talked about those people, the way her mother had taught her that a woman's worth was measured in the quality of her pearls and the status of her husband. She had built her entire identity on a foundation of sand, and Elias Thorne had simply let the tide come in. She pulled out her phone. Her bank app showed the carnage. The margin calls had triggered. Her personal investment accounts, which were tied to the firm's performance, were being liquidated to cover the losses. She watched the numbers drop. Millions turned into hundreds of thousands turned into tens of thousands. By the time the sun began to set again, Elena Vance was, for the first time in her adult life, ordinary. She looked at her phone one last time before the battery died. There was an email, not from Arthur, not from the board, but from a private address. "The handshake wasn't about the money, Elena. It was about seeing if you were someone I could trust with the future. You showed me exactly who you were. Now, you have a rare gift, the chance to decide who you want to be." It wasn't signed, but she didn't need a signature. She stood up, kicked off her heels, and started the long walk home in her stockings. The pavement was rough and hot, but for the first time, she felt every step. She felt the ground. She felt the world. And as she crossed the bridge back toward the skyline, she didn't look at the buildings. She looked at the people passing her by, wondering how many hands she had missed the chance to hold. The next few weeks were a blur of cold glass and legal paperwork. Elena's penthouse, once her sanctuary of success, felt like a museum dedicated to a woman who had died. The movers came on a Tuesday. They didn't care about the provenance of the velvet sofas or the way the light hit the marble counters at dusk. They just wrapped everything in brown paper and tape, packing her life into boxes that looked exactly like everyone else's. She moved into a small one-bedroom in a neighborhood she would have previously described as up-and-coming, which was just a polite way of saying it was loud and smelled like diesel and Saint. Reet food. The first night, she sat on the floor of her kitchen, eating cold noodles from a carton. The silence was different here. It wasn't the sterile, high-altitude silence of the 52nd floor. It was a thick, human silence, punctuated by the sound of sirens and the neighbor's television muffled through the thin walls. She found herself thinking about Elias constantly, not with the anger she expected, but with a strange, haunting gratitude. He had stripped her of the armor she didn't know was suffocating her. Without the title, without the $2.4 billion deal, without the fear of losing status, she was just Elena, a woman with a lot of regret and a sudden, terrifying amount of time. She started volunteering at a community center 3 blocks away. She didn't tell them who she was. To them, she was just Elle, the woman who was surprisingly good at organizing the filing system and who didn't mind scrubbing the floors after the after-school programs ended. One afternoon, she was handing out flyers for a local job fair when she saw a familiar face. It was Marcus. He looked different, his sharp suit replaced by a simple sweater and jeans. He was standing by a coffee cart, looking at the flyers she had posted. "Elena?" he asked, his voice hesitant. She felt a momentary urge to hide, to pull her old mask back on, but she forced herself to stay. "Hi, Marcus." He walked over, his eyes scanning her face. I heard everything went. I'm sorry about what I said that day. I was scared. We all were." Elena shook her head slowly. "You were right, Marcus. It was a long time coming." They stood there for a moment, the city humming around them. It wasn't the boardroom, and there was no mahogany table between them. "What are you doing here?" he asked. "Trying to learn how to shake hands," she said, a small sad smile touching her lips. Marcus laughed, a genuine warm sound. "It's a start." As she walked back to the center, Elena realized that the $2.4 billion hadn't vanished. It had been redistributed. It was in the new parks being built 3 miles south. It was in the small business loans being granted to people she used to ignore. It was in the air, fueling a version of the city that was better because she wasn't the one building. She looked at her hands. They were dry from cleaning supplies, the expensive manicure long gone. But when a young girl ran up to her, crying because she had scraped her knee, Elena didn't hesitate. She reached out. She took the girl's hand in hers, felt the small, warm palm, and for the first time in her life, she didn't feel the need to pull away. She realized that Elias hadn't destroyed her world. He had invited her into the real one. It was messy, it was loud, and it was devastatingly beautiful. And as the sun set over the low-rise buildings, casting long, humble shadows across the sidewalk, Elena Vance finally felt like she was home. The community center was a converted warehouse with high, drafty ceiling, NGS, and the lingering scent of floor wax and old books. Elena spent her Tuesday nights in the basement, tutoring adults who were trying to get their GEDs. It was a far cry from the high-stakes negotiations she used to lead, but the pressure here felt different. It was the pressure of someone trying to change their life, not just their bank balance. She was working with a man named David, a former factory worker who had lost his job when the plants moved overseas. He was twice her age, with hands that were permanently stained with oil and grease. He struggled with the math sections, the variables and the equations that Elena used to solve in her sleep back at the firm. "I just don't see the point of the X," David muttered one evening, rubbing his temples. "Why can't it just be a number?" Elena leaned in. She didn't look at her watch. She didn't check her phone for market updates. "Because the X is the part we don't know yet, David. It's the possibility. Think of it as the space where your future lives. We just have to find the right way to unlock it." David looked at her, really looked at her, and nodded. You're a good teacher, El. You got a way of making the hard stuff feel manageable. Elena felt a lump in her throat. She had been called a shark, a closer, a titan of industry. But good teacher hit her harder than any accolade she'd ever received. She realized she liked this version of herself, the one that didn't need to be the smartest person in the room, just the most present. As she left the center that night, the winter air had begun to bite. The first snow of the season was falling, thin and crystalline, dusting the parked cars and the trash cans. She tucked her chin into her scarf, a cheap wool one she'd bought at a local pharmacy, and started her walk home. She passed a newsstand and saw a magazine cover featuring Elias Thorne. He was standing on a construction site, wearing a hard hat, surrounded by community leaders. The headline read, "The Billionaire Who Rebuilt the Soul of the South Side." Elena stopped. She looked at his face in the glossy print. He looked happy. Not the winner's circle happy she used to see at galas, but a deep, settled kind of peace. She wondered if he ever thought about that day in the lobby. She wondered if he knew that his act of destruction had been the greatest act of mercy she'd ever experienced. She reached her apartment and climbed the 4 flights of stairs. Her legs didn't ache the way they used to in heels, they felt strong. She unlocked her door and flipped the switch. The apartment was small, but it was hers. No ghosts, no expectations. She sat at her small desk and pulled out a piece of stationery. It wasn't the heavy, embossed cream paper from the Sterling Heights group. It was just a plain white sheet. She took a pen and began to write. "Dear Elias," she started. Then she paused. She thought about the $2.4 billion. She thought about the vanished firm. She thought about the hand that yed in his pocket. "I used to think that power was about what you could take from the world," she wrote, her hand steady. "I thought it was about the height of the walls you could build. I was wrong. Thank you for showing me that true power is the strength to tear them down. You didn't just take away my career, you gave me back my life." She didn't ask for a job. She didn't ask for an apology. She didn't even sign it with her full name. She just folded the paper, put it in an envelope, and addressed it to the Vanguard Holdings headquarters. As she lay in bed that night, listening to the muffled sounds of the city through the window, Elena felt a strange sensation. For the first time in 15 years, her heart wasn't racing. It was beating in time with the world around her. She closed her eyes and drifted into a sleep that was deep, dreamless, and finally, completely free. The seasons in Chicago don't just change, they collide. The biting winter gave way to a wet, gray spring that smelled of damp concrete and possibility. Elena's life had settled into a rhythm that would have been unrecognizable to her former self. Her mornings were no longer dictated by the opening bell of the NYSE, but by the chime of her cheap alarm clock and the sound of the neighbor's toddler giggling through the wall. She had taken a job as a project coordinator for a small nonprofit that refurbished low-income housing. The pay was a fraction of what she used to spend on shoes, but when she saw a family move into a safe, clean home, the profit felt astronomical. She was standing on a ladder in a gutted Victorian house on 63rd Street, scraping away layers of peeling wallpaper, when she heard a commotion downstairs. Usually the site was quiet, just the sound of hammers and the local radio station. But today, there were heavy footsteps and the low murmur of several voices. "El? You up there?" It was Javier, the site foreman. Elena wiped her brow with the back of a dusty hand and looked down through the floor joists. "Just finishing the master bedroom, Javi. What's up?" "Someone here to see you," Javier said, his voice sounding uncharacteristically formal. Elena climbed down the ladder, her joints popping. She was wearing paint-stained overalls and a bandana tied over her hair. She looked like a laborer, and she felt like one. When she reached the ground floor, she stopped dead. Standing in the middle of the dusty living room, looking entirely out of place in a bespoke navy suit, was a man she hadn't seen in over a year. He wasn't Elias Thorne, it was Arthur Sterling. He looked older. The lines on his face had deepened, and the sharp, predatory gleam in his eyes had been replaced by something that looked suspiciously like exhaustion. He looked around the skeletal room, his lip curling just slightly in a ghost of his old elitism. "Elena," he said. "Arthur." She didn't move toward him. She didn't offer her hand. She just stood there, holding her scraper like a sept. I didn't think I'd ever see you again. Especially not south of Roosevelt Road." Arthur sighed, a heavy sound that stirred the sawdust at his feet. The firm is gone, Elena. Most of us scrambled. I've spent the last 14 months in litigation, fighting the clawbacks and the ethics committees. It's been a journey. I heard, she said quietly. She didn't feel the surge of spite she expected. She just felt a distant, muted pity. I saw your letter, Arthur continued. Or rather, I heard about it. Elias Thorne doesn't keep secrets as well as people think. He was impressed, Elena. He told a mutual colleague that you were the only person from Sterling Heights who didn't try to sue him or beg for a job. I didn't want a job, Arthur. I wanted to be able to look in the mirror. Arthur stepped closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. The project. The Vanguard project. It's moving into phase 2. They need someone who knows the city's bones but understands the new direction. Thorne. He asked about you. He didn't tell me to come here, but he didn't tell me not to. Elena looked at the walls she had been scraping. She thought about the $2.4 billion that had vanished and the life that had appeared in its place. She thought about the exclusivity she used to sell and the community she was now part of. Tell him thank you, Elena said, her voice steady and clear, but tell him I'm already working on a foundation, and this time it's solid rock. Arthur looked at her. For a long time, he seemed to be searching for the woman who once occupied the corner office, the woman who would have jumped at the chance for redemption in the eyes of the elite. But that woman was gone. He nodded slowly, adjusted his tie, and walked out of the house, leaving Elena in the quiet, dusty sunlight. She picked up her scraper and went back to the ladder. She had work to do, and for the first time in her life, she knew exactly what she was building. The Victorian house on 63rd Street was more than just wood and mortar. It was a physical manifestation of everything Elena was trying to mend within herself. By June, the heat returned to Chicago, but it wasn't the suffocating, artificial heat of the Sterling Heights lobby. It was a vibrant, living heat. Elena spent her days sweating through her shirts, her hands calloused and stained with the honest grime of a life being rebuilt. She had become a fixture in the neighborhood. People didn't see the real estate titan anymore. They saw Elle, the woman who knew how to fix a leaky faucet, and wouldn't stop until the crown molding was perfect. One evening, as the sun dipped low, painting the sky in shades of bruised orange and deep violet, Elena sat on the front porch steps of the nearly finished house. She was alone, the rest of the crew having headed home to their families. She held a cold bottle of water against her forehead, closing her eyes and listening to the rhythm of the street. There was a basketball game going on. At the park across the way, the rhythmic thump-thump-thump of the ball sounding like a heartbeat. A shadow fell across her. She opened her eyes, expecting Javier or perhaps one of the neighbors coming to check on the progress. It was Elias Thorne. He wasn't wearing the charcoal suit this time. He was in a simple black polo and dark jeans, looking less like a billionaire and more like a man who had spent his day walking the city he loved. He didn't say anything at first. He just stood there, looking at the house, then down at Elena. The molding is straight, he said. His voice was just as she remembered, deep, calm, and carrying a weight that had nothing to do with volume. Elena stood up, wiping her dusty hands on her thighs. She didn't feel the need to fix her hair or apologize for the smudge of white paint on her cheek. I did that part myself, twice. The first time, it didn't feel right. Elias stepped onto the first stair. He looked at her, his eyes searching hers, but there was no judgment. There was only a profound, quiet recognition. Most people would have taken the money and run to a beach in Cabo, Elena. Or they would have spent the rest of their lives bitter, blaming the man who pulled the rug out. You didn't pull the rug out, Elias, she said, her voice steady. You just showed me that I was standing on a rug instead of a floor. He smiled, a real smile this time, one that reached his eyes. I got your letter. It's the only one I kept. He reached into his pocket. For a split second, Elena's breath hitched, a phantom memory of that day in the lobby flickering through her mind. But Elias didn't pull out a phone or a contract. He pulled out his hand. He extended it toward her, the same way he had 14 months ago. I'm starting a new initiative, he said. It's not about skyscrapers. It's about sustainable housing, owned by the people who live in it. We need someone who knows the math, but someone who also knows what it's like to have the paint under their fingernails. Elena looked at his hand. It was a strong hand, a hand that had built more than just buildings. It had built a standard for how humans should treat one another. She didn't hesitate this time. She didn't think about her brand, her image, or her status. She reached out and took it, His grip was firm and warm. As their hands met, the $2.4 billion didn't feel like a loss anymore. It felt like the tuition she had paid to finally understand what it meant to be human. "When do we start?" she asked. "Now," he replied. They stood there for a moment, shaking hands on a dusty porch in a neighborhood the world had forgotten, as the Chicago stars began to poke through the haze. The vanished billions were gone, replaced by something far more durable. Elena Vance wasn't a queen anymore, and she didn't want to be. She was a builder, and for the first time in her life she was standing on solid ground. The work didn't happen in glass towers anymore. It happened in community basements, in drafty church halls, and on the very sidewalks Elena used to avoid. Over the next 6 months, the partnership between the disgraced executive and the visionary billionaire became the quietest, most effective force in the city. Elias provided the capital. The redirected remains of that vanished $2.4 billion. But Elena provided the grit. She knew the city's bureaucratic labyrinth like the back of her hand. She knew which council members could be swayed with logic, and which ones needed a firm reminder of their constituents' power. But more than that, she had developed an ear for the silence between people. They were sitting in a small, cramped office in the back of a renovated warehouse, the new headquarters for the foundation project. The air smelled of blueprints and cheap coffee. Elias was looking over a set of site plans for a new cooperative housing complex. He looked up at Elena, who was deep in a spreadsheet, her brow furrowed in concentration. "You're working too hard, El," he said, leaning back in his chair. "The zoning board approved the variance. Take a win for once." Elena didn't look up. "Winning isn't the point, Elias. If we don't get the interest rates locked in for these families by Friday, the whole model shifts. They deserve the security we promised." Elias watched her for a moment. He saw the way she handled the numbers, no longer as weapons to inflate a stock price, but as tools to shield people from the cold. "You know," he said softly, "why, I didn't think you'd actually do it. That day on the porch, I thought you might take the job just to get back into the game." Elena finally looked up. Her eyes were tired, but they were clear. "I'm not in the game anymore, Elias. I'm in the world. There's a difference." The phone rang. A landline, a sound that always seemed more urgent than a cell. Elena picked it up. It was Sarah, her former assistant. Sarah was now the lead administrator for the Foundation's educational wing. "Elena, you need to see this. The morning papers. They found out." Elena's heart did a familiar, unpleasant flip. "Found out what, Sarah?" "The connection. The redemption project. They're calling it the Billionaire and the Pariah. There are photographers outside the site on 63rd. Elena looked at Elias. He had heard the tension in her voice. She felt a surge of the old fear, the fear of being exposed, of the world pointing at her and reminding her of who she used to be. The woman who refused the handshake, the woman who lost a fortune out of spite. "They're coming for the story," Elena whispered, putting the phone down. Elias didn't look worried. He didn't even look surprised. "Let them come, Elena. A story is just a collection of choices. You've made different choices for 18 months. Are you ashamed of them?" Elena looked at her hands. They were scarred, one knuckle permanently thickened from a mishap with a hammer. They were the hands of a worker. She stood up and walked to the window. Below, in the street, she could see a news van pulling up. She saw the cameras being unloaded. She remembered the lobby of the Sterling Heights Plaza. She remembered the silk suit and the arrogance that felt like a suit of armor. She realized that for years, she had been hiding behind her success because she was terrified of her own humanity. "No," she said, her voice growing stronger. "I'm not ashamed." She grabbed her coat, a simple canvas work jacket. She didn't check her reflection. She didn't fix her hair. She walked toward the door, stopping only when she realized Elias wasn't following. "Aren't you coming?" she asked. Elias shook his head, a small, proud smile on his face. "This isn't my story anymore, El. It's yours. Go tell them what happens after the money vanishes." Elena walked out of the office and down the stairs. As she opened the heavy steel door to the street, the flashbulbs began to pop, a frantic, artificial lightning. The reporters moved in, shouting her name, asking about the $2.4 billion, asking about the scandal, asking if she was trying to buy back her reputation. Elena stopped on the top step. She didn't look through them. She didn't look down. She looked at the cameras, and then she looked past them, at the neighborhood she had helped rebuild. She saw the kids walking to school. She saw the new grocery store on the corner. "I'm not here to talk about the money," she said, her voice carrying over the din. "The money was just noise. I'm here to talk about the work. And if you want to understand the work, you have to start by looking at the people it's for." One reporter, a young woman who looked as sharp as Elena once had, shoved a microphone forward. "But Miss Vance, how do you answer the critics who say this is just a PR stunt to erase what happened in that lobby?" Elena paused. She thought about the silence of the elevator. She thought about the weight of Elias's hand in the air. "You can't erase the past," Elena said quietly. "You can only build something better on top of it. I made a mistake that cost a lot of people a lot of things. I can't give them back that time, but I can give this city everything I have left, and I'm starting today." She didn't wait for the next question. She walked down the steps and right through the crowd. She didn't push, she didn't shove. She just moved with a steady, quiet purpose. And for the first time, when a stranger reached out to steady her in the crush of the crowd, she didn't flinch. She took their hand, felt the warmth of another human being, and kept moving forward. The media frenzy eventually faded, as it always does, replaced by the next scandal or the next miracle. But for Elena, the quiet that followed wasn't the empty silence of her old penthouse. It was the peaceful stillness of a life well lived. It had been 5 years since the day the $2.4 billion vanished, and in that time she had learned more about the soul of Chicago than she had in the Privy House 20 years of selling its skin. It was a crisp October morning, the kind where the air smells of wood smoke and turning leaves. Elena stood at the podium of the newly completed Thorne Vance Community Land Trust. It wasn't a skyscraper. It was a sprawling, 3-story complex of affordable apartments, a medical clinic, and a vocational center. It was built of brick and reclaimed timber, designed to last a century rather than just look good on a brochure. She looked out at the crowd. There was David, who had finally passed his GED and was now running the site's maintenance department. There was Marcus, who had left the corporate world to become the trust's financial director. And there, in the front row, was Elias. He looked older, his hair a salt and pepper crown, but his eyes were as bright and steady as ever. Elena didn't have a prepared speech. She didn't have a teleprompter or a PR team whispering in her ear. She just rested her hands on the wooden lectern, feeling the grain of the wood under her palms. "A few years ago," she began, her voice natural and conversational, echoing softly through the courtyard, "I thought success was a number. I thought it was something you could see on a balance sheet or a bank statement. I was so busy looking at the numbers that I forgot to look at the people." She paused, a natural silence that felt comfortable rather than tense. "I made a choice in a lobby once. It was an ugly choice, born of pride and a blindness I didn't even know I had. That choice cost me everything I thought I valued. But in the end, it was the best deal I ever made. Because when the money vanished, I was forced to find out what was left. And what was left was you, this community, this work." She looked directly at Elias. "I used to be afraid to shake a hand because I was afraid of what I might lose. Today, I'm only afraid of what I might miss if I don't." The applause wasn't the polite, rhythmic clapping of a boardroom. It was a roar, a messy, loud, joyous sound that vibrated in Elena's chest. After the ceremony, as the crowd began to mingle and the kids started playing in the new fountain, Elena walked down the steps. She found herself face to face with a young woman, perhaps 22, who was holding a toddler. The woman looked nervous, her eyes darting to the cameras that were still lingering on the periphery. "Miss Vance?" the girl whispered. I'm moving into 3B tomorrow. I just wanted to say thank you. My mom, she never had a place that was really hers. This means everything." Elena felt a warmth spread through her that no commission check could ever provide. She didn't just nod. She didn't just walk past. She stopped. She looked at the woman, really saw the hope and the fatigue in her eyes. "I'm glad you're here," Elena said. "Welcome home." She reached out her hand. It wasn't a power move. It wasn't a calculated gesture. It was just a person reaching out to another person. The young woman took it, her grip strong and grateful. As the sun began to set, casting long golden shadows across the courtyard, Elena felt a hand on her shoulder. It was Elias. "We did it, El," he said quietly. "No," she replied, looking around at the bustling, living heart of the project. "We started it. There's a lot of the city left to build, Elias laughed, a rich, warm sound that blended with the noise of the neighborhood. I suppose there is. I'll see you at the office, at 8. 7, Elena corrected with a wink. We have a lot of hands to shake. She walked toward her car, a modest, reliable sedan, but then she stopped. She looked up at the sky, where the first stars were beginning to pierce through the twilight. She thought about the $2.4 billion. It was a staggering amount of money, a weight that could crush a soul or build a kingdom. She realized now that it hadn't vanished at all. It had simply been transformed. It was in the bricks of the building, the heat in the radiators, the books in the library, and the futures of the people walking past her. She wasn't the woman who refused a handshake anymore. She was the woman who lived for them. And as she drove through the streets of the city she finally called home, Elena Vance realized she had never been richer in her entire life.